Greetings. I'd love to welcome everybody to today's EstesGroup in Conversation event. I am Brad Feakes, and I am president of the EstesGroup. In celebration of EstesGroup's 20th anniversary, we're conducting a series of conversations with some of the friends and colleagues we've met along the way. My guest today is Andrew Stroup. Andrew is an engineer, a serial entrepreneur, and a verifiable weapon of mass destruction, having worked in areas as diverse as fluid power, the federal government, reality TV, and arena robots. With that, Andrew brings a wealth of experience to the table, regardless of the topic at hand. So today, I want to sit down with Andrew, discuss his life, his career, and the road ahead. And with that, thank you for joining us today, Andrew.
Thanks, Brad. Appreciate the opportunity. I'm glad to connect and do a little chit chat. But yeah, excited to chat with you and subsequently the rest of the audience here.
Excellent. Well, great then. Let's jump right into it. Why don't you start off by giving me your leverage debrief here? Tell me about leverage and the work that it does in the industry.
Yeah, for sure. Leverage AI is very much focused on helping out industrial manufacturing and distributors, primarily focused on the mid-market, filling that big black box and gap of really understanding the life cycle of a purchase order, right? Between the time that is created in ERP and sent to the supplier versus the time that hits the dock or the receivable bay, it becomes kind of a big mystery of where it is. And not just from a shipment visibility, but just generally from acknowledgments and updates. So what we do is we partner with these industrial manufacturers and distributors, and then subsequently drive that visibility by finding AI-driven, clever, and effective, meeting them where they are, as they typically will say, with suppliers to give them that visibility, and subsequently structuring all that data that then gives leadership at those companies the ability to make smart decisions around supply performance, on-time delivery, inventory turns, and ultimately protecting revenue. Because as you know, Brad, it's building in the physical space is very different than in software. That's real material impacts, different lead times involved with that across the board. And ultimately, in today's world, between tariffs and the ongoing conflicts, it's and even post-COVID, it's a very different world out there.
No doubt. You had some experience in the world of COVID and its ramifications. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to have spent some time in what they call the Beltway down in DC, a few different tours, as we kind of joke, both, the Pentagon and then helping run one of the tech teams for the Obama administration. When COVID happened, I was actually international. Ironically, maybe not ironically, but fortunately, the last flight back in before they shut off the borders from that country.
Oh boy!
And remember getting a phone call to come help. And the phone call was, from some of the former administration, but also in collaboration with the current Trump administration at the time. And so we were, myself and my co-founder now, and along with a lot of other amazing individuals, stood up this national nonprofit that became a private sector arm to help with the White House and the government and a lot of the other large organizations validate, verify, source, distribute PPE and other medical equipment as a trusted arm. As you probably know, there's a lot of interesting actors out there, a lot of gray market and black market. And so, we went from 0 to 250 people in, just a couple short months. Probably would never do that again. It was very painful and the growing pains, but also at the same time, very fortunate to have been in a position to be able to be helpful for what felt like 6 years over kind of a 6-month period.
Oh boy, I can imagine. Yeah, we have customers in our distribution space who were dealers or distributors, among other things, of toilet paper. And they found themselves suddenly the kingmakers in their respective verticals for, of all things, toilet paper. Is that the sourcing seemed to be one huge area that came out of the pandemic? Was that something that got you into the idea of pursuing sourcing through leverage and that whole concept? Did that kind of take you down that path? Were there discoveries made along the way where you said, kind of connected the dots and say, oh yeah, this is really a problem that needs solution?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was one of definitely the anchor points. To your point, toilet paper, diapers, masks, obviously. I mean, I was, and even in the relatively early days of COVID, still on a plane traveling to distribution center locations between Chicago and LA ports, literally physically validating, the actual boundary layers of the masks and whether they were real or not, and kind of negotiating these crazy deals. In that motion, I kind of mentioned this before as part of kind of the parlay into leverage. We scaled up to about 250 people within, I think, by month 2.5. And the majority of all those people were effectively category managers. They were taking in new vendors. They were validating all of the actual products against catalogs, against samples. And then we were trying to figure out how to list them, rank them. I mean, the evolution of that entire workflow was we were just a place, very fortunate to partner with Andy Slavitt and Mark Cuban. Andy Slavitt being the person who helped initiate some of the Obama administration healthcare policies, and Mark Cuban, obviously, the Shark Tank guru, as you may know. And we started off just being a place for healthcare providers to list what they need. And then that turned into, well, they need all that stuff. Now we have all the demand. How do we go about sourcing and finding those things? Because all these new suppliers are knocking on our door. And then subsequently, we became this place where then we're like, okay, now we have all these sourcing workflows and supply. We became effectively a reverse marketplace and kind of group buying. And so in that motion, to answer your question, yeah, I think one of the biggest pain points we saw was the constant and consistent actions of following up with suppliers, getting the things that we needed, the lack of visibility, and the fundamental value, not like the profit, because as we operated nonprofit helping at the time, but the value that we delivered was so fundamentally clinched to those vendors and suppliers. And so if we couldn't answer that question, we wouldn't be able to know if we could be delivering the value we said we would to these healthcare providers, hospitals, in partnership with the White House, right? And with Amazon and all these other large groups. And so it became a fundamental need of someone surely has made something. And the reality was not to the level that was needed to solve the problem, which, I think the founder's dilemma also is always build the thing that people don't have or haven't created that desperately the world needs. Mm-hmm. Found out during COVID.
Nice. I love that. The founder's dilemma. So that's interesting. When I look back at your own background, in terms of where you came from, tell me a little bit about that and how your engineering background took you to where you are today.
Yeah. Well, the bad joke about me is that I was made in Korea and raised in cowboy boots in Oklahoma. So I went to school at Oklahoma State, studied, both aerospace and mechanical engineering, with the focus in minor in mathematics and business management. So I was very, even though raised in the middle of America, definitely was an overachiever, or at least tried to be during that time period. I was very fortunate to have been in a position to be mentored in kind of fluid power. The very small tangential anecdote was my mentor's mentor was one of the 3 graduate researchers out of post-World War II MIT research labs that developed basically the fluid power construct and the idea of research. And then he stood up the Fluid Power Research Center in Oklahoma State that turned privatized. And I ended up working very heavily underneath his kind of key mentor or his mentee. And we traveled around to, Canada and the oil sands to down in Boca Raton with General Dynamics and the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle to helping out with Disneyland's California Screamin'. Like it kind of, this was like the age of 20, 21. I couldn't even drink at the time. But I was running these major projects. Having that amazing opportunity and probably staying in college a little bit too long. They actually told me that I needed to leave, otherwise they were going to charge me more money. I ended up getting approached and taking opportunity at DC, my first gig there, which is at the Pentagon and joint operations on the chemical, biological, and nuclear defense side. And so worked very closely with some of the bleeding technology when it comes to that level of weapons of mass destruction and the defense thereof, as well as working with some of the next gen aerospace platforms like the F-35 and KCX and a whole bunch of other kind of platforms along the way as well. And so, fortunate to be in a position to be kind of picked and also hustle and open that aperture. I could still be sitting in Oklahoma and maybe still be still hanging out in that part of amazing part of the country, but fortunate to have come out to DC and kind of take there. And so like that engineering path of, having someone kind of tap me on the shoulder and be like, you need to go do this and you need to come follow me and learn a little bit was a very amazing opportunity at the time.
Right. So you grew up in the Tulsa area, I'm assuming then?
I did. I went to school called, or I grew up in a city called Sand Springs, which is kind of the western suburbs. And I think that the claim to fame was that we went 0-13 in football that year when I graduated high school. So
Oh boy.
we were. It's a fun suburb. It's a great place. But I love Tulsa to death. I think people like George Kaiser and all the different work there around kind of leveling up Tulsa's been an amazing opportunity to see that change in the landscape. Have you been?
Sure. Oh yeah, I had a customer who owned a plasma cutter company in Dewey, Oklahoma. So right near kind of where the Coffeyville Amazon Center used to be in Dewey. So tiny little town there. And you see the same cops perched at the same places waiting for you to break 25. So I learned that lesson.
Making that money, that monthly quota. I know.
Yeah. Yep. And I'd be sending my family home pictures of cows grazing right next to oil pumps. So the oil pumps are chugging away and the cows just chewing away. And it was a nice blend there. And then Bartlesville nearby. Yep. I got caught in an obscene Midwestern thunderstorm in Bartlesville. I went to go see Frank Lloyd Wright had a building there, kind of out of all things. So I went, like anyways, architectural gawker, just go find an interesting building and gawk at it for a while. But then the storms washed me back to my hotel pretty quickly. So love that area. And that's pretty intriguing. I like Oklahoma for nothing else. If you were 0-13, I bet it was because everybody was on the wrestling team, would be my guess.
Yeah, well, and then also, there's this kind of the rise of like the super, what they call like 6As in high school, where you have 2,000 kids, and so like the option pool is a little bit bigger when you go to high school with only like 150, 200 people.
Sure.
To your point, like the architecture there, and Frank Lloyd Wright, like I think they're actually figuring out what to do with that building. I saw it in the news not too recently of like how to handle the next step and the next phase of that building as well. But there's definitely some interesting architecture. I do miss sometimes the open range, if you will. I grew up, both my grandparents grew up on farms, and had a lot of friends who had farms and ranches around the country, and so it's definitely a different feel than the East Coast, to say the least.
Yeah, no doubt. And it was in that wonderful area where the jet stream would hold fast, and sometimes it would be a little north and sometimes it would be a little south. So they said that these guys would have winters that would be radically different, because in Dewey, one winter you'd see no snow, the next you'd see nothing but. I had a guy who was trying to finalize his divorce, and his meeting with his lawyer got canceled because they got 2 inches of snow. And I'm a Canadian who lives in Wisconsin, so the idea of 2 inches of snow stopping anything was a little bit of a chuckle. But they had a lot of fun over that. So with that, tell me let's talk a little bit about reality TV. Every now and then I bump into a guy who's been through the reality TV ringer. How did you find yourself in that situation? For our audience, you were a member of the Discovery Channel's show, The Big Brain, where it looked like you put a bunch of very intelligent people who were willing to break things and encourage them to break things. Tell me a little bit about that experience.
Yeah. Another amazing opportunity. There, I think, are moments that in people's lives of kind of, they think about things before and after. And I think if you talk to, there were 10 of us on the show, contestants. I think if you talk to probably all of us, we would say like one of those, fundamental moments in our lives was like the before and after the TV show. And it wasn't necessarily like that it like led to like massive stardom. I think it was just like a shift of perspective. And I don't think it happens with every TV show, reality TV show at least. But, ended up applying one random, I think, Tuesday. A coworker mentioned actually that someone that they knew was applying, and that I was equally as crazy and, reasonably intelligent, that you might enjoy doing it. Definitely did on a whim. Part of a kind of a 40-person casting call in LA. I ended up crashing my bike on the, in Palos Verdes, and was walking limp during the actual casting calls. I went through crazy amount of psychology interviews and IQ tests that no one knew we were taking. I remember even, I think in the interviews we had to take apart and put back together a vacuum cleaner while being grilled with a whole bunch of like technical questions and personality questions at the same time. But ultimately it was great. I mean, the format was pretty simple. It's 10 people, 2 teams of 5, 8 episodes, all given a mission, 3 to 5 days long. You had to compete to figure out who were the team captains. Everyone stayed on, but people would get eliminated. So you kind of like, you get eliminated, but you're still there during the show. And you have captains, and then you have 3 to 5 days to design, build, and deliver against a target, a goal, an objective, and then compete against another team. So anything from protecting an exploding payload over 25 miles an hour to building an anti-projectile defense system, or an elevator from a 3-story waterfall, deployable bridges from a truck across like a 40-foot ravine, like all these things. And, ultimately it was designing it. We had, kind of a world-class fabrication shop in each of our kind of bays. We were ordering crazy amounts of things from McMaster and Granger and Swage Lock and, everything in between. And then ultimately, you'd compete and you kind of build this thing for like a one-time true kind of like minimal viable product use to see if you could beat the other team and also have the most innovative idea. And so it was a great opportunity. I think the things that I think are most memorable about those is that, it shifted my mindset from kind of like a standard kind of 9 to 5 mentality to like an always on. And we were always on. You'd wake up at 6 a.m. with the camera on your face. You'd be mic'd up. You'd be working from 8 till 8 or 9 p.m. every night. You'd have a couple of hours while you're still on camera, and then around midnight you'd go to bed with the mic coming off, and then you do it all over again. And I think some people run away from that. Some people dislike that. I think I'm a glutton for punishment. I want more of that, and that kind of spurred the series of all of the entrepreneurial efforts thereafter.
Yeah, I imagine that's about as good a real world example of rapid prototyping, and must be kind of nice to have all this machinery at your disposal. And then, yeah, it sounded like the ability to source materials and such at a whim. That would be about as good an opportunity to get into the entrepreneurial product development mindset as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny. We actually had, they have these things called production assistants on these reality TV shows, which are basically just very amazing but underpaid staff that's, doing all these random tasks. And like literally we had, I think, 2 dedicated each of us for each team each day, running 3 to 4 trips to Granger, McMaster, and whatever we needed. Like we need these part lists because we'd always be given a budget, like, $5K, $20K. And so, I think the other thing as an engineer and someone who likes to solve problems and always trying to fight for like the physical world, having the ability. I remember in college being told once that I did this thing called design, build, fly, which is you basically design, build, fly a UAV. Before they were called drones, we were called them UAVs back in the day, unmanned aerial vehicles, and we won. And Oklahoma State has a history of winning this competition against MIT and Caltech and everyone else. And I remember someone telling me like, don't get used to this. Like you will never be able to develop anything cradle to grave again. This is it. Like you're going to go to Boeing and, design some bolt on the fuselage, and that's going to be your life. And to be fair, that is some people's career trajectory, and they work in a big organization. I had a lot of disdain. I think I do most things out of spite, unfortunately, but I had disdain for that. And I think the ability to go on a show in a very short amount of time, basically do 8 mini master theses with someone else's money, and build that muscle memory was a great opportunity for everyone on the show.
Nice. You strike me as a secretly spiteful person. I can definitely attest to that. It's funny because you talk about aviation and fluid power. I just came back from the NFPAA, National Fluid Power Association conference, and they had one guy, their keynote speaker. When we put this back to YouTube, I'll stick a link in the description to their organization. They came up with a means of using pneumatics to control a helicopter for paraplegics. So a fellow who had lost his ability to fly fighter jets for the British Royal Air Force learned how to fly a helicopter through pneumatics. So there's a whole system that simulates all the pedal pressing that's needed to control a helicopter through pure fluid power technology. And they were actually there, as a motivational speaker. There's a lot of that naturally, but also they were there looking for, technology tricks and such to try and take their own process and push that farther. So yeah, at some point we'll have to hook you up with the NFPAA. Great group, and definitely in the distribution space. A lot of fun to work with people like that. Question that I always have with the reality TV stuff is the fact that they're following you in and out of the bed. And obviously, these shows seem geared to have some sense of or desire for interpersonal drama. How did that play out? And you take a bunch of propeller heads and put them in a room. Do you find that it's more like the Big Bang Theory, or is there actually any kind of interpersonal drama that can actually be sequestered out of a situation like that?
Well, I think there's definitely drama to be sequestered. I don't think it's inherently that hard to imagine when you put people in an unknown situation or an unknown environment, and then subsequently you are putting them in a pressure cooker of competition. And I think if I was on, I can be honest because it's been over a decade now in this category, but I remember showing up even when we were like signing the agreements with all of us, and kind of like you're looking around the room and kind of figuring out, like, can I do this? Because like there's always that divide of like what you've learned in school versus what you do in real life versus the actual ability to like, I'm gonna like build this thing and find these random people to build this with me in a very short amount of time and be on national television at the same time doing it. So it creates a lot of tension and stress. I will say, they have story producers. Their entire job, we'd be given two each for each team, just to follow us around and like kind of watch in the back monitors to try to like pluck out the story and narrative that they want to be able to communicate. And I think that a really good story producer, and I've met a few along, over the past decade or two or so, is ones to like not force it, but to ask really good questions and help guide those. And then the drama kind of just comes out, right? Because humans are humans. I think humans inherently love the mess of things and to create that kind of drama by nature. And so I think reality TV is just a reflection of that. But waking up at 6, going to bed at midnight with a camera on the entire time, egos, you kind of have to have a certain type of type A personality anyways. And we took 3 different personality tests and talked to psychologists during the screening process. So they already had us profiled of the different roles, personas. And so definitely wasn't probably too hard to get the outcomes that they were looking for.
Right. I can imagine. That's a really intriguing idea of finding the narratives that exist there and asking good questions to solicit those versus trying to lay a framework on top of that. Just kind of let the drama emerge organically. That seems to make a lot of sense. My marketing hat, I always want to figure out, that's kind of what marketers are forever trying to do, right? Find the thing and find out what the narrative is behind the thing so that you can sell the narrative. Now, when you were working in that, I noticed one guy, Guy Cavalcanti, and I noticed that you ended up working with him in the area of a company called Megabots. Now, when I read your initial biography of a guy who works with battle robots, I was expecting, nice portable, from the TV show, little things with blades and hooks and flamethrowers. But what you guys were going at was a next level. Tell me a little bit about how that came about and what you were after there.
Yeah, giant fighting robots. I mean, honestly, I think the joke is, if there's only 2 types of people at a bar, there's, someone that you mention giant fighting robots and they immediately turn into a 10-year-old kid because they have so many questions, and the other person has no idea what you're talking about. And so it's a very polarizing conversation set. I think looking back on it, Guy at the time, very, very intelligent mechanical designer. And when we met on the show, he one late one night, probably a couple weeks into the show, he was like, "Look, I run this makerspace in Boston, and I used to work at Boston Dynamics, and I have this vision, and I'm trying to figure out how to build, this idea of like giant robots, giant fighting robots." And it was kind of like a forming idea. And I was like, well, that's very funny you should mention that. One, funny enough, I also like the idea of giant robots, but spent time in fluid power, aerospace, in both, like mid-grade and very high-grade pressurized systems, and subsequently also spent time at the Pentagon, randomly, interestingly enough, funding the Boston Dynamics projects that you were working on because they were being used for the chemical, biological, nuclear defense program. And so he was like, well, look, we have this idea. And we started putting this together. I jokingly at the time told him, I was like, look, if we find some investors crazy enough to give us money to build giant fighting robots. Wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, we should go do it. And so, that was kind of the genesis of it. We ended up bringing on a third co-founder. His name is Matt Orline. He was an amazing individual, helped out with all the controls and helped run ops, and built a very long-lasting relationship with him as well. He was actually just catching up with him not too long ago. And so the three of us built, we get to, claim to fame of being the first giant fighting robot builders in America ever. And we will hold that. We created it, took it to Japan, fought Japan and won. And, it's one of those things that I think any engineer gets the opportunity to build it. I've never met anyone who said like, man, I really wish I couldn't build giant fighting robots, because I think everyone deep down has that funny desire, because it's a dream, right? You're trying to connect this idea of, behind you, like Star Trek, this idea of what does the future look like. And I think there's a few people out there who get to take that shot, and it's pretty enticing and romantic in many ways.
Right. I'm assuming then you've seen the movie Robot Jocks from the 80s.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we've seen all of them a few times, and very, very, between that and Real Steel and Pacific Rim, all of them, I think they're an inspiration for what can be, right? I mean, sci-fi is a great proxy, and I think Star Trek's also a great example of like the dystopian futures of what could be, to help kind of inspect where we are and where we want to go, right?
Right. For me, when I saw, the actual machines that you guys had constructed, to me, it felt entirely out of this old movie, Robot Jocks. Robot Jocks for me has a warm place on my heart. So you talk about the people on one side of the fence or the other. I know very quickly which side of the fence of the battling robots I am, because this thing looked exactly out of, and for our audience, Robot Jocks was a low budget kind of B movie about the Cold War and Russia and America settling their disputes through gladiatorial robot combat. And you'd have these machines, pretty much mech suits with the same scale of what you're looking at, with a bloodthirsty arena around them. It was pretty hammy, but the very idea that you could be constructing these mechanical devices to pull this off. I imagine for you, was it largely hydraulic driven in terms of its movement?
Yeah, I mean, it was all hydraulics. Well, that's not true, actually. There's a good amount of electrical controls, obviously, especially like the servo side to control the robot itself. But I mean, a lot of it was a really impressive set of mechanical design, a lot of fluid power considerations. We actually, early days IP, created a hydraulic CVT that we could use to displace and ultimately figure out how to put someone in the middle of where typically the powertrain would sit. We also did use pneumatics in the sense of building a 6-inch diameter giant paintball gun that would go 120 miles an hour through a car. And a whole bunch of missile launchers, and so ultimately, I think it's like, a very large adult, large kids, AKA an adult's dream to be able to do some of this stuff. And we were given kind of that latitude to build. And so a lot of, water jet cutting of very thick steel plating, and spending a lot of time MIG welding and TIG, and hooking everything up. And, being also the first giant fighting robot pilot is also not just being the builder, but being the one sitting, in the tandem style, flight style suit inside is pretty cool too.
Right. What kind of risk do you have as a driver in one of those? And you mentioned that you went to Japan.
Imaginary. Any possible risk that you could think of is safety. Safety was a hopeful consideration, I think, in most times.
Funny. Has that area taken off since your departure, or is that something that just kind of happened and is now in a holding pattern?
I think, well, I mean, two parts to that. One, it's, I think hindsight's always 20/20. I think ultimately what we were trying to go after was building the next giant fighting, sports league, robot sports league. And, you kind of saw follow-ons to this. Obviously, there's a couple of TV shows around. I mean, obviously, like, Robot Wars, but then you had like the Robot Fighting League, and then we saw like drone racing. And so there's a whole bunch of kind of categorical ways. I think the things that we learned was, when building a company, simplicity wins, focus matters. I think it's one thing to figure out how to build a giant fighting robot, which is hard in itself. But I think another dynamic around figuring out how to build a sports league, and typically sports leagues get centered and built around sports that have been around for hundreds, tens, hundreds of years, right? And so a lot of problems are trying to solve at the same time, which I think was a challenge. I think that, ultimately there will be a place for the concept of a giant robot or giant fighting robots. I think seeing the progress of some of these new bipedal robots coming out, tied with the new works with, LLMs and Gen AI and all the things that we're doing there is really amazing. I can't wait to, bend to, robot overlords one day. And look, we'll get into Terminator scenario, and I guess I'll be part of the narrative arc of being like, those were the guys who helped kind of like, kick it off in the wrong direction of like building a giant fighting robot and prove that it could happen.
So you're the Miles Bennett Dyson of our era.
I mean, it could play that way. I'm trying to end up in the right side of history, but I don't think you always have that control. So, but I'll stake the claim of being still the first giant fighting robot builder, and maybe we can get a museum one day. We'll see.
So in terms of design, I go back to software design where you have waterfall approaches, you have agile approaches, and everything in between. In terms of the design of this machine, did you guys have a really good layout of what you wanted to construct? Or did you have to kind of run into a challenge and work your way around that challenge? How much did the original idea and the final product differ when things were done?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this now. It's been a little bit. I think from a visual aesthetic perspective, we got pretty close. I mean, a lot of inspiration came from MechWarrior. If you look at what a MechWarrior looks like, and this idea of these like bipedal, inserted into the chest kind of operating machines with like two kind of like weapons on their arms or the shoulders, and even like tank treads or bipedal motion, whatever have you. Come to find out, it's at least in the realm of when we were executing, it wasn't that hard, in the sense that like it took a lot of focus, it took a lot of skill set and execution, it took a lot of experience to know how to do that. But past a certain threshold, it's like, great, we can do this. Like, that's easy. I think the next layer of the granularity of control and feedback loop and speed and maintaining that with second order systems is a very pretty massive step change, which can be deceptively hard. And you kind of see this in a lot of the research labs with like MIT and a few others that kind of work through this. But like, that control feedback loop system that's required to give that fidelity, and more specifically to get to the speed and response time necessary that you kind of match up in your head of like what you think a giant robot, like you think like Robotech and Terminators, like they kind of defy physics, right? And so now ultimately you're trying to like mirror that. That I think is a really hard part, which is really just a controls, heavily controls and all these subsequently the right type of hardware and equipment. For us, we're kind of like, we're looking like, how does it look like an earth mover to build the stepping stone to get there, especially in the early days.
Nice. And, you've talked about your work in government. To what degree was any of that work in conjunction with any of that, or was it entirely at this point an independent venture?
Yeah, I mean, it was very different, very independent. I mean, there were very, very initial conversations around, military applications or government applications. We generally made the decision to stay away from that. I think ultimately you kind of like pick the line of where you want to spend your time and focus. I think with the government work, especially when I went back down to DC after we were moving from Boston to California and moving Megabot's headquarters there, as we were kind of partnering up with SolidWorks and a whole bunch of other different teams out there, was the work during the Obama administration was really a very different perspective around how do you apply this knowledge, like this technical domain expertise and perspective on systems thinking, first principles, the best practices of business and aspect to go from an audience of tens to hundreds of thousands who love giant fighting robots and is learning about you to, ultimately the federal government as a user base has 330 million customers, and they're called the US population, right? And so the scale is very different, and the speed is very different. And so very different mission sets. Although I would say, I think, everything you kind of carry with you, right, in that category, and learn and grow, which I think is part of the journey.
Right. Now, it's interesting enough. I mean, in our current age, not to get too political, the level of lens upon government agency interactions and spending habits and activities, et cetera, I don't think it's ever been, any closer and any more microscopic. We'd be frying an anthill with a magnifying glass. Now, what, in terms of your experience of execution within a government organization versus execution as an entrepreneur, what were some of the big kind of paradigm shifts that you'd have to make when shifting from one to the other?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think two big things came from it, like one at the beginning and one at the end. One actually like after it finished, and I'll explain both of them. The first one was figuring out why I was there. You get the call from the White House to say, "Hey, we need you to serve your country." You kind of just salute the flag and just show up, right? Like it's
Right.
like the biggest. It is the best recruiting tool ever when the president gets on stage at South by Southwest and says, "Hey, we need you to serve your country by joining our team." Everyone's like, "What can we do?" Like you get chills down your back and kind of salute the flag and just be like, "Show up," right? And so you get there though, and you kind of figure like, well, what am I supposed to do? Right? Like, these people have been here. The administration is going to rotate at some point. You have political appointees. You have life government employees, which I was part of at one point. I think the biggest thing was as long as you're given enough latitude to execute, which we were given a lot of top coverage during the administration at the time. I knew I was being impactful during that time period when I was constantly saying yes to things. And immediately, being in a leadership position, immediately when I started saying no to more things than yes to things, it was a sign that I became part of the Borg, right? To Star Trek references. I joined the Borg, I'm part of the machine, and I need to GTFO and just depart and go do something else. Because the purpose for me was a tour of duty to help be a change agent, to support those who are going to persist and stay in federal government, to ultimately then leave it a little bit better than we found it, to support the 330 million users, the citizens, and it's not to stay forever. And so I think, equally knowing when to join and also when to leave is very important. And it's very quickly to figure out, about a year and a half in, I was like, I think it's time for me to leave. I think it's there. I think the second lesson I learned was actually what I ended up doing afterwards. Through a happenstance of meetings, I ended up meeting a person named Craig Froelich, who was the Chief Information Security Officer at Bank of America at the time. And I had no idea who he was at the time. I was kind of sharing this narrative story of giant fighting robots and the TV show and the White House, national security. And he was like, "I want to hire you." And I was like, "I don't know who you are." It's just colloquially, a white guy in a suit in DC. There's a lot of different things that they can be, and it's very obtuse. But ultimately, I joined this kind of entrepreneur in residence role at Bank of America. And it was interesting because I had the top coverage in the security organization, which had unlimited budget at the time, thanks to Brian Moynihan and kind of the priority of security. And so we kind of operated in and out of the organization. I think the biggest one of the key takeaways I actually learned between also the federal government and also big business and Fortune 50 and like top second commercial bank in the world is that they just have a different inertial operational mode, right? Like they have this massive inertia going on. In the federal agencies, each one is like their own ship. And I wrote about this once before, but it's like, like Department of Transportation, GSA, DOE, like they all have their heads as secretaries. They have the ship. They're at kind of the behest of the president, but not really because they're senator confirmed, and they kind of have their own mission set. But like they're trying ultimately the president's trying to like shape or guide the direction of all these ships at the same time, right? And the reality is like they're going to leave. In 4 years, those people are going to depart. Typically, they aren't the secretary anymore. It's definitely not the president anymore, at least after 8, hopefully, generally speaking. And but it's different I think in business though, right? At a Fortune 50, if you don't make friends with a certain head of a specific business unit, they might be there for the next 15 years. And so, you just like, how do you navigate part of the business where you need to, where you kind of like navigate, it's like it's one giant ship. Bank of America is one giant ship. It's not really multiple ships doing different functions. It does have different functions, but has one singular mission. And so I think being aware of navigating, managing the inertial movement of these large ships, either a fleet of them or one, is a very different construct than running fast, breaking things, running as a startup.
I could imagine. Yeah, that's a pretty significant mind shift. Now, speaking of mind shifts, tell me about your shift from engineer to IT guy. How did that happen? How did you suddenly start finding yourself writing code? Was this something that came out of your engineering background, or did you stumble into it?
Yeah. I think it was a bit of a stumble into it. I think I was very hungry for trying to figure out where can I iterate the fastest, right? And this is like the rise of like Ruby on Rails, and security was very hot. My first startup was in cybersecurity, kind of the identity and access management space. And ultimately, it was always around kind of like where are interesting problems to solve that I believe that I could be impactful. And I kind of had this like lifelong motto of really optimizing for things centered around where can I have the biggest impact and how quickly can I have that impact, right? And I've been very fortunate to have kind of been able to ladder that impact up over time. I think that software was a very easy escape from the physical world for a little bit to say, great, like how can I rapidly iterate, rapidly learn? I chose building a company over going to MBA school because I felt like the tactical learning environment was just way more interesting. And the iteration cycles are fast. I think ultimately I ended up back in a space where I still deal with the physical world just through our customers and kind of that capacity and that which I think is a very challenging but also fun environment to be in because now you kind of get a taste of both. I don't know if I'd ever start another hardware company, but maybe if it's going to space, I'm definitely very bullish on the idea of, the future generations traveling to low Earth orbit, the moon, and Mars beyond. But I think ultimately, it's really about iteration cycles and impact and reach. And I think, I spent even time my early university career coding, doing modeling simulations and second order differential equations and dynamic step changes to predict fluid power systems, which is something that we were doing for these big companies. And so knowing that software can enable in a systems thinking first principle approach, I think is a very intoxicating idea when it comes to like software itself.
Nice. Tell me then about this shift back to leverage a little bit. Tell me about the development cycles. You talk about iterating. How did you take that mindset into your product as you rose with leverage and tried to make it do more and better things?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately for us and the team, we constantly are pushing ourselves of what is the smallest unit of value we can consistently deliver to our users on a high frequency basis. I think that the challenge that we've seen is that it's not easy to find, when it comes to recruiting, really smart people who want to solve really hard problems that are really good at it, right? Like you can find like really smart people who don't want to solve hard problems. You can find people who want to solve really hard problems but aren't really good at it, right? But like that trifecta, I think solving something as unsexy as PO automation using AI and in mid-market industrials of manufacturing distributors doesn't sound that sexy. But when you dig down to like a really hard problem, this is a massively hard problem that you've seen like industries fail at being able to tackle, like EDI and others, and that's what makes it fun. But I think ultimately that's also where you can delight the users a lot, right? Like they're used to such old school tech and processes, but it's a journey. Like you're taking them on a journey, and you're catching them up in certain categories. You're learning a lot from them, and when we think about building, we think about what is obviously the most common thing that we can build for as many users as possible and prioritize that, but also what's the smallest incremental thing that we can deliver to get feedback loop as quickly as possible. I think people can get in a trap of building things without putting the problem set on a time series, and also trying to build too much before getting a feedback loop with observability and good decision making. If you put things on a time series and you build the smallest feedback loop possible, you can build really amazing things very quickly, which is something we really focus on in our team as well.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Now, as you've described yourself, a serial entrepreneur, what is it that drives you to start a new product or create a new service set versus finding a company to latch onto and synergize with them? What's going on inside of your mind that says, okay, we got to start this from scratch and go from here?
Yeah, I you know one of our principles at the company, and I think ultimately principles of a company are like really the definition of the founding team. So myself and my co-founder Nadav, as well as the team that makes it up. But one of them is really around ownership. I think the sense of ownership, not from like the pure equity sense or like whatever there, but like just like the sense of being able to like own your destiny, I think is very intoxicating. Um, I think also, around there being able to like have, and I mentioned this before, like having the biggest impact possible is a very fundamental, I think, baseline for me is how I operate as a person. So as I think about how I spend my time, and how important that is, and ultimately where that limited amount of time, I think, there's this saying, I'm sure Brad, you feel this way too. It's like, I remember when I was younger, people would say like, when you get older, you have less time. And I was like, yeah, of course, functionally, I understand how physics works and like the time series nature of human life. But it's like, actually, as you get older, you feel like you literally have less time of the day, right? So you have to be more judicious around how you spend it. And so what does that most impact? And then I think the final thing is always around growth, right? And what I mean by that is I'm not really overly religious, but there's a Buddhist construct called dukkha, right? And it's really around suffering. And I think people sometimes get it wrong, where for me, it's really the concept of choosing. The biggest luxury in life is to be able to choose your suffering that leads to the growth that you want, right? And so I constantly am thinking about what can I do to put myself in a state of suffering that ideally I construct that I believe grows us in a certain direction. And I think that's very impactful. And so those are kind of like the barometers. Just generally speaking, over time, it's usually been the category of the best way to do all those three things is to just do it yourself.
So you're telling me entrepreneurship is one big cold plunge.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely like a final decision logic of those who cannot. It was they say like an innovator's last decision or last vestige is to be an entrepreneur, and so kind of end up in a scenario where like, well, I guess I have to just do it myself. So
Right.
here we are.
No, I like that. So when you look at that, what were the biggest challenges in spinning up a new organization? Is it product based? Is it funding based? Is it team? Is it getting early traction? What are the bigger challenges you see when you start spinning up a new company like this?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's around. I mentioned this a little bit as well around. Well, I'll talk about like functional company decision stuff, and I'll talk about personal stuff. And like, I think those are kind of two very important different distinctions. Um, I mentioned this a little bit before. Time series really matters. I think people generally forget, and myself included, to put things on time series. But when you do, I think the hardest thing about starting a company and operating it is really around understanding how to put things in the right order of priority. It typically isn't hard to figure out what is important, what's not important. I mean, there's the decision logic, and typically, if you time block your schedule or you create a list, if things don't keep getting done, that's probably because they're not that high priority, right? It's just a functional logic thing, but it's really about putting it on a time series. And when you put it on time series, you kind of see where things play out, kind of look at it a little bit differently. And then back to the question of like, how do you create like the smallest iteration feedback cycles with observability, with scientific method? That's how you build a sustainable, with the right level of acceleration velocity type of company. That's ultimately companies are designed to make revenue, right? Like that's what makes the world go round. I think the personal side of this is, someone once told me, which I thought was very profound, was that like your company grows as fast as you do. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that around kind of the stages of growth, especially as I've gotten older. And I know, look, I'm 15, but as I approach 40 this year in a couple months, that it's really around how do I think about my own personal growth that has direct impact to said company, right? It's very intertwined. And so, the way in which I think about taking care of my health, both physical and mental, the construct of balancing, personal relationships and where I live and my work-life balance, which I have none, by the way. I have work-life interconnectivity, but all of that really is tied to, I think, in a direct tie and relationship to the outcomes of the company. And the reality is we're all human. We all screw up. We make good decisions, bad decisions. I think a deep sense of ownership and taking those, I think, is important. But those are the two things I think are really hard, is being aware of those two things and discipline around it.
Right. Now, having founded a bunch of organizations in the past, what does it feel like watching them as they move off kind of independently now that you're in a new thing? Is it like, are you the jilted wife, or are you the proud father? How does it feel looking at an organization on the outside when you spent a lot of time being on the end?
Yeah, Brett, I mainly would say neither for me. I think as I'm as I think about this, I think mostly it's just being grateful for the opportunity. Um, I once again not overly religious, but like there's these things that happen that you don't quite know how to explain. The series of events that occur that you're not quite sure how it came to be. But thankful to be in the right time, right place, right position, right amount of knowledge. Kind of like that idea of like manufactured luck in some categories. And so, as I've stepped back from some, or have wound some down, or have transitioned some over, or thought about what to do next, or even like changing administrations. I think it's just like a sense of like gratefulness that I was able to play a role in the capacity I did, and obviously wanting them to succeed in the most impactful way that they think is effective, with me not being in the capacity role, whether it's at the helm or something similar.
Right. No, that's awesome. And with leverage, now you're still on your way up and expanding. Do you see specific areas in the software that you're looking to expand into? Those increments that you've been talking about. Any increments you look to make beyond what you're doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a buzz by all accounts, as you can imagine. But the stuff that our team is doing around agentic workflows, around enabling, whether it's at the integration stack or whether it's at the engagement with suppliers and the intelligence around it, or the summarization of all this amazing data that's never existed before for these companies, on being able to interrogate and understand their supply performance, on-time delivery, unit cost, lead time drifts, and the impacts related to their core business. I mean, we're stepping into this category. I'll tell you a quick story, and maybe that's a good one, Brad. It's like, in our very early days, we had AI in our name, and this is like 2018. And no, and AI was not sexy at that point. It was just like a weird domain from a different country that you could pick up, and it was only really talking about NLP and ML models at the time. Natural language processing and machine learning models at the time. But we had a whole bunch of investors who put money in that were AI focused. And they knew that at the time we weren't really applying much AI, because we were doing something very specific that I think was very impactful. It's, how do we take a customer segment, industrial manufacturing and distributors, on a journey that they can use AI impactfully to their core business in an area that they never thought they could. And one of the chief data scientists at the time when I was there, the Obama administration, DJ Patil, him and I were catching up once, and we're kind of talking about like the impacts of AI and data and machine learning models. And like leverage really is, I think, a great example of, there's like this analogy of like Disneyland, right? And it's funny because I spent time there. Like, you go to Space Mountain in Disney World, and you have this like 2 or 3 minute ride that's like exhilarating. It's very fascinating. Like, the Imagineers spend all this time. And most AI companies, even today, in the current state of all this like voice work that's happening with the GPTs and the LM workflows and the Gen AI, and the limits and the struggle they're having, even though they're having a big flash of pan, like they all want to be like that. Like they're trying to, like they end up being like the 2 or 3 minute ride in Space Mountain. The reality is that it ends very quickly. But the real value is that if you figure out how to be the line that takes 2 to 3 hours to get to, and how to get people into that line, and how to make it smaller, and then ultimately how you enable your customers to go on that 2 to 3 minute ride over and over again, that is where the unlock is. And so we spent the better part of 5-6 years really thinking about how do we solve this one very obtuse problem set with no data, that takes hours, days, weeks to generate this level of information and insight, streamline it, and then get our customers to that point where they're no longer waiting, hours, days, weeks to go on that 2 or 3 minute ride over and over and over again, because we have been able to help them arrive to that solution. And that's what we get excited about, right? Like, we spent the time doing it, which is, there's going to be amazing AI solutions out there. There's going to be amazing agents. That core logic and the ability to build that data in an impactful way for a very specific market segment that's massive in the US, alone is what's intoxicating and attractive about this.
Sure. Oh, that's awesome. It looks like we're wrapping up our hour today. So as we do that, Andrew, I want to really thank you for a great conversation. We went in all kinds of unexpected directions, which is what I hoped for. So big thank you for that.
Absolutely, Brad. Yeah, really appreciate the time. Obviously, appreciate the journey so far of us learning to work together and build more, and looking forward to what 2025 has in store.
Absolutely. So
Maybe giant robots.
Oh, there we go. It's a date. And to our audience, we'll be putting out an edited version of this in due time on our YouTube feed with some links and such back to Andrew and the work he's doing. And look forward to doing that. We'll be doing some more of these conversations in the future. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Andrew. And I hope everyone has a great day.